Dog Days by Nikolas P. Robinson. October 3rd, 1987. The tree line at the edge of the hill just beyond Lee's trailer was lit in strobing red and yellow, visible as they approached along the main road. The faint flickering orange glow of flames took a little longer to make out, but they were apparent before they reached the turn onto Lee's property. Rudy accelerated into the turn, onto the rutted gravel road, bouncing in his seat before laying on the gas, the truck shuddering in response. Lee braced himself as best he could in the passenger seat, fighting the impulse to jump out of the cab and race on foot to the smoldering remains of his two-bedroom trailer. Through the open windows of the truck, the acrid smell of smoke became increasingly potent as they neared the cluster of emergency vehicles encircling the home. Not giving Rudy a chance to come to a stop, Lee bolted from the truck and ran through the assembled volunteer firefighters, slipping on the sodden ground but maintaining his footing. "Diz! Logan!" Lee shouted loud enough to be heard over the deafening engine sounds and noisy radio chatter emanating from the trucks. One of the firemen turned his way and attempted to stop him from approaching the still-burning husk of his home. But Lee pushed past the man and only came to a stop when the scorching heat from the ruins seared his flesh and forced him to squeeze his eyes shut against the burning sensation. Rudy finally caught up with him and gently pulled him back to a safe distance, out of the smoke and haze rising into the cool night air. Lee collapsed to the muddy, torn-up ground, sitting hard enough to jar his tailbone, eliciting a wince. Tears were already cleaning paths through the soot accumulated on his face as he stared blankly at the remains of his home. "Sir, is this your home?" Lee shook his head and glanced up to the man speaking to him, realizing this wasn't the first time the stranger had asked the question. The fire chief, accustomed to delayed reactions under these circumstances, patiently repeated the question a few times before receiving a response. "Yeah," Lee said, turning his eyes back to the slowly dying fire. "Well, I'm sorry to tell you, there's not going to be anything left." Staring straight ahead, Lee asked, "What about my dogs? Diz and Logan were in there when I left this afternoon." Diz and Logan were Lee's 5-year-old Dobermann pinschers. He'd gotten them from a family friend when they were puppies, after moving back home to be near his parents in 1982. Ill-tempered and not altogether too bright, they were Lee's best friends just the same. Rudy was about the only friend of Lee's the dogs didn't instantly scare off. Even his family members were on edge around the two of them. "Well, there do appear to be remains in the trailer," the fire chief said. Lee inhaled a gasping breath, sucking in a lungful of smoke in the process, and he started coughing. "What the fuck happened here?" Rudy sounded more aggressive than he meant to, but he loved those dogs almost as much as Lee had. "It's too early to tell just yet, but there is evidence of accelerants nearby," the fire chief replied. "We located a couple of gas cans that appear to have been discarded, one in the driveway and another near the far side of the trailer." "Excuse me?" Lee unsteadily rose to his feet. "You're telling me someone started my house on fire with my dogs inside?" "Like I said," the fire chief answered, "it's still too early for us to know for sure, but that's my initial assessment." Lee's mind raced through the possibilities, trying to imagine why anyone would do something like this. He didn't have many friends, but he didn't have any enemies either. He was still lost in his thoughts when he realized the fire chief was still talking to him. "What was that?" he asked. "Do you have somewhere else you can stay?" Rudy spoke up. "You can stay with me tonight." Lee shook his head. "It's all right, Rudy. No need to put yourself out. Could you just take me to my mom and dad's place?" Rudy nodded his head. "Will I be able to collect the remains of Diz and Logan?" "Of course," the fire chief replied. "Once we've gotten everything extinguished here, we'll collect them for you and deliver them to where you're staying." "Thank you," Lee said. Pulling a small notepad and pen from his pocket, the fire chief asked, "Could I get an address and phone number where you'll be staying?" Lee provided the details before letting Rudy guide him back to his truck. After explaining the situation to his parents as best he could, Lee tossed his smoke-tinged clothing in the washing machine before taking a shower. He waited for the laundry to finish, watching The Tonight Show until he could transfer the wash to the dryer before he fell asleep almost instantly upon lowering his head to the pillow. Had he not been so exhausted and emotionally drained, he might have been plagued by nightmares. But he slept peacefully. It was 9 a.m. when the call came in from the fire department informing Lee that they had the remains of Diz and Logan retrieved from the fire and ready to drop off with him. There was a sliver of good news as well, in that his Jeep had escaped any damage from the fire. It'd need a thorough wash, and it was probably going to smell like smoke for as long as he owned it, but it meant he hadn't lost everything in the fire. The rest of that morning was spent with a shovel behind his parents' house, digging the holes that would serve as graves for Diz and Logan. Glancing over at the plastic sheeting his two companions were wrapped in, he couldn't stop his attention from shifting to dark places, wondering what their final moments had to have been. Lee imagined their confusion and fear as the fire and smoke filled the trailer, the way they probably scratched at the walls and whined in panic and fear, waiting for him to rescue them. He didn't realize he'd been crying until he tried to focus on the depth of the hole and realized his vision had gone blurry. They'd been good dogs, and they deserved better than to die afraid. Lee could only hope that they'd passed out from the smoke near the beginning. Seated in the disturbed soil between the two graves, Lee was overwhelmed not by only the loss of Diz and Logan, but by the fact that everything he owned was in that trailer. He'd lost everything else along with his dogs. Whoever had done this to him, they'd better hope the sheriff tracked them down because Lee wouldn't be nearly as kind. October 20th, 1987. A couple of weeks passed, and there were no arrests made. As far as Lee was concerned, there was no progress at all. He isolated himself in the spare bedroom at his parents' house as he navigated the unpleasant and confusing labyrinth of after effects with the insurance company, the fire department, the county sheriff. Frustrated with the whole damn thing, Lee pulled his jacket from the doorknob, called Rudy, and walked the 2 blocks down to the bar where he usually played pool. He hadn't drunk so much as a drop of alcohol in a while. He'd quit drinking a few years earlier and started attending AA meetings, and he wasn't about to piss away that progress. But he hoped throwing some darts might take his mind off of everything else. The bartender and a couple of regulars at the Bar K came up to him to tell him they heard about what happened and offered their condolences. Lee appreciated the gesture, but the last thing he wanted to do was talk about it. Rudy walked in a few minutes after Lee, and the two of them tossed darts for the next half an hour. Under normal circumstances, Rudy wouldn't be winning more than a third of the games, but Lee wasn't focusing as well as usual. "Have you heard anything yet?" Rudy asked. "Not a fucking word," Lee said, launching the dart at the board. "God damn," Rudy shook his head. "I'm sorry to hear that." There wasn't anything more to say, so they didn't say anything at all as the games continued. When Rudy finally left for the night, Lee sidled up to the bar and settled in to drink soda and listen to some music before heading home for himself. He was just about to leave when he caught the furtive glance from a man he vaguely recognized at the opposite end of the bar. He was a regular, but not someone Lee knew well enough that he could place a name with the face. "Can I help you, Hoss?" Lee asked, doing his best to smile and diffuse the situation just in case. Without any hesitation, the guy got up from his stool and walked over to where Lee was sitting. "You're the fella who had his house burnt down the other day, ain't you?" The smell of booze and bad breath wafting off the man was almost enough to turn Lee's stomach. Lee wasn't sure where this was going, but he nodded his head solemnly. "Well, that same night this guy tried to come in here when I was standing outside smoking a cigarette. This man, he smelled like smoke and gasoline, so I laughed and told him to steer clear because he was likely to go up in flames if he came near my camel." "This was the same night the fire happened?" Lee was interested now. "Yes, sir," the man replied. I know it was because my brother-in-law works for the volunteer crew who got called out there to put your trailer of yours out. Have you told anyone about this? Well, I'm telling you right now, the drunk said. But no, I ain't told no one else because no one else asked, and they wouldn't listen to me even if I tried. Lee didn't know how to reply to that. The man was a drunk, but a broken clock was still right twice a day. The man continued talking, taking Lee's silence as confirmation he could go on. But anyhow, this guy acts spooked when I point out how he smells, and he turns tail and heads back the way he came. Can you tell me what he looked like? Lee asked, not sure if it was worth asking the drunk what he'd seen a couple of weeks earlier. Sure can, the drunk grinned as he replied. I've seen him here before. The drunk's description was better than Lee could have hoped for, and it only took a couple of minutes before he was able to match that description with a man he recalled clearly from a week or two before the fire. That motherfucker. Lee excused himself and exited the bar. He'd seen the man who'd started the fire right there at the bar, the last time he'd been playing pool. Lee knew where to go to find out who the guy was. He only hoped he could get the information from the younger woman. He recalled the place he'd dropped her off more than a month before, and he remembered the events leading up to that moment clearly. No good deed goes unpunished, and Lee muttered to himself as he thought about how the whole thing had started. September 17th, 1987. Lee Melvin didn't drink, but the Bar K was the best of two bars in the small town that the small town had to offer, at least for pool or darts. So that was where he spent his time, surrounded by one of the vices he used to love so much. It had been a rough handful of years following his 3 tours in Vietnam. He'd re-upped for the additional tours less out of a sense of patriotism or a belief in the right and just cause of the war than because he'd developed a taste for the heroin in Vietnam. And he wouldn't have had the easy supply stateside. He'd taken to drinking instead when he'd gotten home. But that was all behind him now. Lee could spend hours in a bar without any temptation to buy himself anything harder than a soda. Hank Williams Jr. was playing on the jukebox when Lee heard the man's voice raised in anger before the speaker self-consciously transitioned to a harsh whisper that conveyed the same ire, but at a hiss that barely registered over the sound of the music inundating the bar. It wasn't uncommon to hear arguments breaking out at the Bar K, occasionally developing into fights. But the persistent, irritable buzzing was still going on intermittently when Lee finished his game with a scratch on the 8-ball, so he decided to check it out. As George Strait was singing about dancing to Merle Haggard on a Saturday night, Lee made his way to the bar where he'd have a clear view of whatever the situation might be. He ordered a Pepsi and tried to surreptitiously watch the argument taking place between a man and a woman in a shadow-squeezed booth near that far end of what served as the dining area. The disagreement continued for a while, as Lee monitored the situation before the man finally stood and abruptly yanked his girlfriend or wife to her feet, dragging her toward the rear exit. The guy was crushing the woman's wrist a little too tightly for Lee's comfort. No doubt she'd end up with a bruise there, the sort of thing that would have her wearing long sleeves even if the day happened to be unseasonably warm. It'd be a companion to the faintly shaded bruising still visible around her left eye socket, where her makeup failed to conceal the almost but not quite healed bruise. Lee knew he was going to get involved, against his better judgment. It was bad timing on the part of the abusive boyfriend or husband, whatever the fuck he was. Lee was sensitive to that sort of thing. It was only a couple weeks earlier that Lee and his 2 younger brothers had met up with their brother-in-law as he was arriving home from work to let him know that if he ever laid a hand on their sister, or the older of their 2 nephews again, they'd kill him. The youngest of the 3 brothers had found out about the abuse in his sister's household, and he'd immediately informed Lee and Lance. There was no hesitation on their part. They'd held off until their sister had gone out for bowling leagues and waited for her husband to get home. None of them laid a hand on him, as strong as the temptation was, but they'd made it clear that no one would find what was left of him if it happened again. They had to hope their sister would never hear about the intervention because Lee imagined she'd appreciate it about as much as she'd enjoy a full frontal lobotomy. It was with that incident fresh in his mind that Lee swallowed the last of his Pepsi before he followed the man and his abused partner outside into the poorly lit gravel parking area behind the bar. He couldn't see them at first, wondering if they'd somehow managed to pull out of the parking lot in the little time he'd taken coming out after them. But then he heard a scuffing in the gravel off to his left. He slowly approached, sticking to the deeper shadows to remain unseen. But he burst into action immediately upon seeing the man holding the woman against the side of the late 70s Ford LTD by her throat. Lee slammed the palm of his right hand against the man's ear, stunning him enough to release his hold on the woman as he staggered back from the blow. Gently nudging the woman and placing her behind him, Lee squared up between her and the man, who was at that moment shaking his head rapidly to restore his senses. "She's leaving with me, buddy," Lee said. "Who the fuck are you?" The man's slurred speech was further garbled by the dizziness he was experiencing as a result of Lee hitting him, but the question was intelligible enough. "I'm just a guy who doesn't like seeing a woman manhandled like that." Lee slowly backed away from the man, leading the woman with him until they reached his Jeep. He refused to take his eyes off the seething drunk until they were pulling out of the parking area and hitting the road. "Where can I take you?" Lee finally asked, as they got a quarter-mile down the road. "Thank you," the woman said. "You're welcome." Lee waited for her answer, but when he glanced back to the passenger seat, the woman was asleep, probably passed out as far as he could tell. She was more of a girl, he thought, probably barely into her 20s, and she'd already gotten herself mixed up with the sort of man who'd treat her like that. "Well, fuck," he muttered to himself. "I guess you're coming home with me." As he pulled off onto the gravel road leading to his trailer, he snickered to himself for a second before sighing and saying, "Hope you like dogs." Lee opened the door to the trailer and returned to the Jeep to retrieve the girl. He negotiated the circuitous route through the living room as Diz and Logan excitedly circled him and tried to sniff the stranger he'd brought into the home. After depositing the young woman on his bed, he closed the bedroom door behind him and gave the dogs the attention they insisted they required. Laid out on the sofa in his living room, Lee finally fell asleep an hour later, with Diz curled up near his feet and Logan sprawled out along the edge of the couch, just before the television filled the room with quiet static as the broadcast day ended. He woke up to the young woman playing with Diz and Logan on the floor. They appeared to have taken to her well. Enough for the stranger in their home, alternatively assaulting her face with their tongues and rolling over to present their bellies for scratches. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to wake you." Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Lee sat up. "It's okay. How are you feeling?" He glanced at her wrist and neck, the bruising from the night before much clearer in the daylight, streaming in through the windows. "I'm all right," she replied, quickly turning her eyes to the floor when seeing where Lee had focused his attention. "We just fight sometimes, Sean and I. He gets angry when he's been drinking." "Well, now that I know his name, how about yours? I'm Lee." "Susan." "Is there somewhere I can take you, Susan?" "I can go to my sister's house," she said. "That's where I usually go after Sean and I've been fighting." "You should probably stay away from that Sean guy," Lee said. "People like him don't tend to get better on their own." "I know," Susan said. Lee felt almost certain that she'd end up back with him in a matter of days, if not hours, but it wasn't his business to tell her what she should do. It wasn't as if his own life hadn't consisted of a series of bad choices for quite a few years. "Well, you're all right with me if Diz and Logan like you," Lee said with a smile on his face. "They're really sweet dogs." "You might be one of the only people who agrees with me on that point, Susan." She excitedly scratched at the top of Logan's head between his ears. "Not exactly the vicious guard dogs one would expect looking at them." "That's right, you two. Lull her into a false sense of security." Diz and Logan, knowing from Lee's tone of voice that he was talking to them, began to shake their rear ends, the bobbed tails frantically waving back and forth. "Well, let's have some breakfast, and then I can take you to your sister." "That would be great," Susan said. "Pancakes and bacon sound okay to you?" "I'm starving," she replied. That sounds fantastic. October 21st, 1987. Lee vaguely recognized the woman who answered the door. She looked enough like Susan that she was obviously the sister he'd dropped the young woman off with the month before. Hello there, ma'am. My name's Lee Melvin, he said. I was hoping I could talk with Susan if she's here. Susan ain't here, the woman said, her tone curt. Is there any chance I could get a phone number or an address from you? Lee knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. He was so close. A month or so back, I dropped her off here after she'd gotten in a fight with this guy, Sean. Come in, Lee. My name's Shelley. Shelley led him to the living room and gestured to the love seat where Lee sat down. She seated herself in a recliner across from him. Susan's in the hospital with a brain bleed, Shelley said after a deep sigh. She went back to Sean a week after you dropped her off here. Fuck. Lee couldn't help himself. Sorry about the language, ma'am. It's okay, she said. I've said far worse since I got the call from the ICU. Sean, Lee asked, the question hanging in the air. Shelley nodded her head sadly. Well, damn, Diz and Logan really seemed to like Susan. Shelley stared at him, unsure what he was talking about. Never mind, Lee said. When did it happen? Just a couple of weeks back, Shelley said. Sean claims she slipped in the kitchen and hit her head against the counter, but I know better. Lee didn't have a response to that. He'd heard these excuses echoed in AA meetings from both the victims and their abusers. If you don't mind my asking, Lee, why did you come looking for Susan today? He didn't trust himself to concoct a lie, not one she wouldn't see through. At least Lee figured the best option was the truth. Well, I was hoping she'd be able to be here with you and she could tell me where to find Sean. And why are you looking for Sean? Lee breathed deep and prepared for the risk he was about to take. Someone burnt my trailer down the beginning of October. The one guy who had any information for me described Sean perfectly. Told me how he showed up smelling of gas and smoke the night the fire happened. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts and halfway expecting Shelley to kick him out of her house, but she didn't say anything. My dogs were in the trailer when it happened, and I lost everything else I owned as well. Shelley didn't say anything for a couple of minutes, staring at her hands clasped in her lap. The silence was oppressive. Lee was worried that he'd crossed a line by telling her as much as he had. Are you going to hurt him? Shelley finally asked. I'm not sure I should answer that, Lee said. I think you misunderstood me, Mr. Melvin, she said. I want you to hurt him. Tears welled up in Shelley's eyes before she could continue. I want you to kill him, she said, her final words obscured by sobs. Lee smiled warmly before saying, I think I can manage that. Shelley provided him with all the information he needed, including Sean's schedule at work. As Lee descended the front steps of Shelley's house, he began formulating a plan. October 25th, 1987. All of his shopping and preparations taken care of over the previous couple of days, Lee was waiting in the bushes outside Sean's garage when he pulled the LTD in. The man didn't see anything coming when Lee came up behind him as he was pulling the garage door closed, and he probably didn't feel a thing as the homemade blackjack connected with the back of his skull. He crumpled to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been severed. Lee quickly ran to the alley where he'd left his Jeep parked, pulled around the corner, drove up to the garage, and hauled Sean into the back seat. He didn't see any neighbors, but that didn't mean no one had noticed, so he quickly bound the man's wrists with duct tape and took off before any looky-loos might have a chance to call the sheriff's office. They had a long drive ahead of them, and while he didn't expect anyone in law enforcement to follow him where he was going, there was always the slim chance someone might be careless or bold enough to follow the Jeep where Lee was going. The gravel road turned into a rutted dirt path as Lee guided the Jeep deeper into the mountains and forest west of town. The trail they were following could only loosely be described as a road, but Lee had navigated the old fire trail enough times that he knew the twists and turns by heart. Bouncing around in the back of the Jeep, Sean came to after 10 minutes of rough road conditions had knocked him around like a pinball, most recently slamming his shoulder into the passenger side window. "What the fuck?" Was that a question or an exclamation, Sean? Lee grinned as he glanced up the rearview mirror to check on his passenger. "Who the fuck are you, and what the fuck is this?" "You've sure got a lot of questions back there, little Firefly." "What are you talking about, asshole?" Lee slammed on the brakes and turned on the dome light before turning to face the man in the back seat. "You know damn well what I'm talking about, you pissant motherfucker." Lee's voice came out as a growl. The look of recognition on Sean's face spelled it all out for Lee, and there was no question he had the right man. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, and for the first time Lee wondered if this man had expected him to be in the trailer when he sighted Ablaze. "We're taking a trip, you and I," Lee said, his tone more relaxed. Popping a cassette into the tape deck, Lee said, "Let's have some tunes for our adventure." As Jimmy Buffett's Cheeseburger in Paradise began playing, Lee began to laugh at the inappropriate soundtrack. Not for the first time, he started to wonder if he might have come entirely unhinged by recent events. Jerking the bound man from the Jeep, Lee unceremoniously tossed him to the cold, hard ground. The chill in the air was enough to see his breath, but not quite enough to be truly uncomfortable. Not that Lee was at all concerned about Sean's discomfort. With the Jeep's lights turned off, Lee's eyes were slowly adjusting to the darkness. The half-moon was playing peekaboo with the thin wisps of cloud dancing through the sky, and he figured it would be sufficient for the night's festivities. "Don't fucking move," Lee said as he went around to the back of the Jeep to extract the things he'd purchased for this adventure. "I'm fucking sorry, man." Sean sounded like he might be crying, but Lee couldn't see well enough to make out the tears. He didn't bother responding as he finished putting everything together. "I'm so sorry," Sean said again. "You don't know what sorry means yet," Lee said. "But you will." As Lee returned to the front of the Jeep, placing the compound bow on the hood, he could tell Sean's eyes had adjusted to the forest darkness as well, because the man started screaming. "We're halfway to the middle of nowhere, Sean, buddy. So I wouldn't bother with the screeching if I were you." He continued screaming until his voice grew hoarse. "I told you," Lee said. "Best you can hope to attract with all that hollering's going to be a hungry mountain lion, maybe a bobcat or a coyote." Sean gulped loud enough that Lee could hear it from where he stood a few feet away. He laughed for a few seconds. "I'd probably just leave them to it if some odd animal decided you'd make for a good midnight snack." Lee bent down over the bound man with a hunting knife in his right hand. Sean attempted to wiggle backward and away from him, but Lee slapped him with the open palm of his left hand. "Knock that the fuck off, moron. I'm liable to cut you instead of this duct tape if you keep moving around like that." Sean stopped attempting to get away, and Lee sliced through the tape, freeing the man's hands. Standing again, Lee returned to the front of his Jeep, where he retrieved the bow from its place on the hood. He gestured for Sean to get off the ground, and the cowed man complied. "Here's how this is going to play out," Lee began. "I'm going to give you a head start to get the fuck out of here. After 5 minutes, I'm coming after you." Sean whimpered, and that was followed by a faint sounds of water dripping on the ground. "Did you just piss your pants?" Lee asked. Sean looked away, and Lee couldn't hold back his laughter. "We haven't even gotten started, and you already pissed yourself," Lee said, fighting back laughter. "This isn't going to go well for you at all, son. I thought you were a tough guy beating up on a woman and starting a man's house on fire." Sean didn't reply. "Where's all that piss and vinegar now?" Lee asked, before he chuckled again. "Well, We know where the piss is, I guess. You don't have to do this, Sean said. His voice quivered with fear. Oh, I think I do, Lee said. More than that, I want to do this. Sean started crying, and this time Lee's eyes had adjusted sufficiently that he could see the tears glistening in the moonlight. Knock that shit off, Lee said. He was so irritated that the words came out as more of a snarl. Now when I say go, you need to start running. Please don't do this, Sean said. His voice was hollow. Somewhere inside, he knew there was no stopping the man who dragged him out here. Go. Sean hesitated for only a split second, and he was off. The trees were ghostly gray all around him, and he was just about to cross from the clearing into the relative security of the nearest copse of aspen or birch when he felt an excruciating, searing agony in his right calf mid-stride. As he attempted to put his weight on the leg, he collapsed and stumbled forward. Dirt and dead leaves ground into his open mouth and swallowed along with chipped teeth that shattered against the rocks and stony ground. Lee approached him, laughing hysterically. Pulling the arrow from Sean's calf without any consideration of the damage he was doing, Lee wiped the bloody projectile clean on Sean's shirt. Leaning down close enough that Sean could feel Lee's hot breath on his cheek, he whispered, You burnt my dogs alive, with no chance to escape, and you believed I would actually give you a chance? Wincing in pain, Sean looked up at the dark silhouette standing over him. They were just dogs, he said. The next sensation Sean felt was a heavy blow against his temple, and everything faded to black. It wasn't dark anymore, Sean could tell before he opened his eyes. There was heat, too, and the crackling of a fire. It's about time you fucking woke up, Lee said, just as Sean struggled to sit up from where he was sprawled on the ground. The agony in his leg was enough to force a cry from his parched throat. Hurts a bit, doesn't it? Lee asked. Fucking of course it does. Hey, there's some of that spirit, Lee laughed as he slapped his knee. This can't be over some fucking dogs, Sean said. I'd be careful what I say if I were you, Lee said. The earlier amusement drained from his voice. This isn't just about Diz and Logan, though. This is for Susan and Shelley, too. I'm so sorry, man, Sean said. I've learned my lesson. I ain't a teacher, Sean, Lee said. And this sure as shit doesn't look like a classroom to me. Sean tried to get to his feet, but dropped to the ground again as soon as he attempted to put weight on the injured right leg. Oh, fuck, that hurts. It's about to get worse, Lee said as he came at Sean with the hunting knife in his hand. Lee stayed with the fire, stoking it and adding more wood and kindling throughout the night. Once he'd adjusted to the smell of burning flesh, it wasn't so bad. It was the scent of the hair singeing that made him feel sick for a little while, but that didn't take long to dissipate. Stacking some stones around and above the fire allowed him to create a sort of white trash kiln, and there wasn't much left of Sean when he was done. There wasn't much left of the man before he'd even started feeding his remains to the fire. But he'd stayed alive longer than Lee expected after he'd started, cutting off parts of him, beginning at the extremities. The hunting knife hadn't been the best tool for the job, maybe, but Lee had been a hunter long enough that he knew he just needed to get in between the joints. Oh, how that man had screamed as he'd lost his fingers and then his toes. Lee had been careful to cauterize each new detachment along the way, hoping he'd keep both Sean alive a bit longer and give him a bit of a sense of what it felt like to burn. In the end, Lee was confident that he'd made his point. Scattering the ash and charred bone all around the forest near the clearing, Lee figured it was possible someone might come across one or more of the pieces of Sean, but he doubted there was any way to identify the man from what he was leaving behind. And even less chance it could be connected to him. Even if the sheriff came knocking, Lee was content with how things had played out. Each bone he'd tossed into the trees, well, he imagined he was tossing it to Diz and Logan, and that thought made him smile even as it made him sad. Author's notes. Dog Days is a true story up to a point. My Uncle Bob interrupted an altercation one night between a husband and wife or a boyfriend and girlfriend at the /J Bar and Grill in Piedmont, South Dakota. Getting the woman away from the abusive partner was just the sort of thing he would do. Unfortunately, his intervention subsequently led the angry man to tracking down Bob's mobile home and setting the house on fire. Bob was not home at the time, but his 2 Dobermann pinschers, Liz and Dugan, were trapped in the trailer when it went up in flames. The arsonist did indeed find his way to the /J after setting the fire, smelling of smoke and gasoline. In the true story, this is what led to his arrest. Naturally, there are a lot of details I've fabricated along the way, most notably the events following Lee discovering the identity of the man who started the fire and killed his dogs. I was, of course, not present at the bar when Bob intervened with the couple, nor was I present when he arrived home to find his trailer gone. The events are true, while the details are entirely the product of my imagination. Liz and Dugan were indeed ill-tempered dogs. While I thought they were beautiful, they were also aggressive and scared the hell out of me as a kid. I was a kid, after all. It wasn't just me, though. Those 2 dogs put most people on edge because the only person in the world they seemed to love was my Uncle Bob. Bob's history before the events at the /J isn't entirely dissimilar from those of Lee's background leading up to the event at the Bar K. Not only did Bob serve 3 tours in Vietnam, he was awarded for his actions during the time with the Army. This is from the South Dakota Department of Veterans Affairs. Robert M. Roseland was awarded the Air Medal for heroism in December of 1968 after he and fellow crewman Joel S. McDaniel risked their lives for the success of their mission. The citation from Roseland's award reads as follows: "For heroism while engaged in aerial flight in connection with military operations against a hostile force. These men distinguished themselves by exceptionally valorous actions while serving as crew members aboard UH-1C helicopter, supporting a Special Forces reconnaissance team besieged by overwhelming enemy forces. Upon arriving over the team's location, they pinpointed enemy positions and placed effective machine gun fire on them. The enemy gunners returned fire, yet these men fearlessly leaned out of the aircraft to continue firing. During the extraction of the team, they provided suppressive fire, which drove the advancing enemy force back. Their courage and professionalism contributed immeasurably to the success of the mission. Their actions were in keeping with the highest tradition of the military service and reflect great credit upon themselves, their unit, and the United States Army." I like to think that, to Bob, his actions in Vietnam were no different than those at the /J that fateful night. They were just the right things to do, and he did them without question. While I was growing up, Bob was a father figure to me in ways my own father was not. After losing his home and his dogs, he moved to Montana, and it was a highlight of my childhood when I got to take trips there during the summer months to spend time with him. Between Bob, my 2 other uncles, Terry and Doyle, and their father, my maternal grandfather, also named Bob, I had plenty of positive male role models in my life. It was in tribute to both my grandfather and my uncle that I named the character Lee Melvin. My grandfather's middle name was Leo, but I liked Lee, just the sounded better. And my uncle's middle name was, of course, Melvin. Knowing how I feel about my dogs and the sort of person Bob was, I can only imagine the anger and anguish he felt knowing that his 2 dogs died the way they did. I felt like Bob deserved a bit of that John Wick brand of justice, so I gave it to him in this story. It's what I would have wanted for myself. Bob's daughter and I both agree that he would probably appreciate this transformation into sort of a redneck John Wick. Lee's first physical interaction with Sean when he boxes his ears was a tribute to Bob as well, a man who consistently threatened to box my ears until I looked like Spock. Additionally, the Jimmy Buffett cassette wouldn't have been far off from the truth. The sheer number of times I heard songs like Cheeseburger in Paradise while I was in the car with my uncle is virtually incalculable. Bob passed away in May of 1996, when I was 17 years old, only a couple of months before my oldest child was born. The last time I saw him was in a veterans hospital in Fort Harrison, Montana, shortly before he was taken off the ventilator that was keeping him alive. This is Nikolas P. Robinson, and that was Dog Days. Thank you.